Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, ESPN has another offseason survey from coaches and execs. There's some folks out there that think Anthony Edwards either is or will be the NBA's best player right now or this season. We'll talk about that today, my thoughts on it. Also, Ant's comments on the older generation of basketball players still getting some play. And now Kevin Garnett weighs in. We'll talk about that. Also, an offseason reset, the cap, and what to expect. Could the Wolves extend Rudy Gobert this year? It's all coming. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy hump day. Hopefully you're having a fantastic week here. The last week of August, we are less than a month away from going back daily with the show, having training camp, the whole thing. We're getting there nearly through this desert, offseason basketball desert, if you will. Lots to get to today. I want to talk about, I want to start with the ESPN survey. I think these are always so fascinating. There's a lot of Timberwolves, a lot of Anthony Edwards in the survey. So I want to get to that here first off the top. A big thank you, though, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with two B's, two E's, C-K-E-N. All right. So let's talk about Anthony Edwards. So these ESPN surveys, we talked about one last week that was centered on the season and centered on, I mean, there were predictions for Rookie of the Year. Actually, I think that made it into this one as well. There were various predictions over at ESPN that the Wolves were in quite a bit. Right, there was the Reid was in Sixth Man of the Year conversation, Rudy in the Defensive Player of the Year, the Timberwolves team success, all that good stuff was all mixed in. This one is focused mostly on individual players, MVP, and then also the actual title winner. There were some questions in the last one, like teams that improved the most, teams that improved the least, best, worst offseason, stuff like that. We did that, I don't know, beginning of last week or end of the week before. So go back and listen to that one if you missed it. But this one's a little bit more high level. Or at least the bigger name awards. And it's, again, a panel of 18 NBA coaches, scouts, and executives. So they're all people that work for NBA teams. We don't know if it's like first-year scout or 20-year scout or GM or, analytics guy or assistant coach. We don't know. It doesn't say. Coaches, scouts, and executives. But there's 18 of them, and they all work for teams, whatever that's worth. The first question in the survey is, who is the NBA's best player right now? 15 of the 18 votes were for Nikola Jokic, which is what I was actually a little surprised it was that high, honestly. I think it should be. I think it's easily Jokic, but I was surprised he got 15 votes. Luka Doncic received 2 votes, and Anthony Edwards received 1 vote for who is the NBA's best player right now. And then at the end of that blurb, it says there was a West scout who chose Edwards, and all he said about it was, it's his time. That's a quote from the West scout who picked Edwards as the best player in the league right now. Here's the thing. I can't argue with a straight face that he's the best player in the league right now. I can't do it. I'm not going to try. I'm not going to give you that hot take today on Locked On Wolves. I also think that I guess justification, if we want to call it that quote from the West Scout doesn't jive with the question. Saying it's his time doesn't mean he's the best player right now. It means maybe he's the best player at the end of the year, which that's another question we'll get to here in a minute. But you can't argue he's the best player in the league right now. You just can't. But it's telling that somebody thinks he is. Somebody within an NBA team thinks Anthony Edwards is the best player in the league right now. I would say it's Jokic. This is maybe a topic we'll get to here, maybe early September. We're still, some fun offseason content. League's best players. I know a bunch of NBA rank lists are going to come out here soon. I think Ant is absolutely in the top 15. You could argue top 10. You can't argue top 5, I don't think even. Nikola Jokic is number 1. Doncic, I'm fine with being 2. Embiid's got, I know the injuries, but Giannis, those are in some order the top 4, right? Like, I just don't see Ant being in the top 5. You can argue top 10. And again, we'll get to that later. But just fascinating that somebody actually voted for him. Somebody that works for an NBA team in the Western Conference, no less, chose Anthony Edwards as the best player in the league right now. Who will be the NBA's best player in 5 years? This one also surprised me. 12 of the 18 voted for Victor Wembanyama. That makes sense that 12 of the 18 did, but what surprised me was how the others were split up. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander got 2 votes for the league's best player in 5 years. Luka Doncic got 2 votes. Anthony Edwards got 1 vote, and Nikola Jokic got 1 vote. This is where Ant should have gotten more love. I understand why that many people think Wembanyama, and if I had to, gun to the head, had to pick who's the best player in 5 years, I might pick Wembanyama, which I realize I can't say might. If I have a gun to my head, I have to just make a choice. I understand the Wemby thing. I was surprised he got 2 out of 3, 65, 67% of the votes, 2/3 of the votes. That surprised me. SGA getting 2 votes is kind of crazy. He's going to be 31 in 5 years. Jokic is going to be, how old is he now? He's 30 now, right? He's going to be mid-30s in 5 years. And I don't know. Is he even going to be in the league in 5 years, or does he want to go play in Europe in 5 years? I don't know. I was surprised Jokic got a vote. I was surprised SGA got 2 votes. I understand Doncic. He's still going to be 30, though. Edwards will be 28 in his athletic prime. Maybe a little past the athletic prime, but in his NBA prime in terms of the combination of skill and still athleticism at 28. So I was really surprised. I thought it would be like Wembanyama, 2/3 of the votes, and Ant, 1/3 of the votes. But instead, it was split 2 for SGA, 2 for Luka, 1 for Ant, 1 for Jokic. This is one where I would argue for Ant. I could make a very compelling argument that a player who's improved as much as he has, that has the right combination of all the stuff we always talk about with Ant, the athleticism, but also the skill, but also the size, also the durability, also the attitude, the mentality, all of the above are reasons why this can happen. We haven't seen Wemby win yet. Now, we've seen the impact he had on the Spurs defense when he was on the floor, and especially as the year went on last year. And his improvement from October to April last year is pretty crazy. But I think we need to see a little more before. Now, remember, people said this in the NBA.com GM survey. Cat was getting votes as the league's best player, overwhelmingly for a couple of years in a row. And that obviously didn't pan out. I don't think Cat's ever, I think there were a couple of years in there we would have said he was a top 15 player, certainly top 20, but he was never a top 10 player, has never been a top 10 player. So Wembanyama getting 12 votes and Ant only getting 1 for best player in 5 years surprised me quite a bit. Let's hit a couple more here real quick. Who will be the NBA's best player? Oh, no, that's the one I just hit. Who will be the MVP this year? SGA got 7 votes. Luka Doncic got 5. Ant, Jokic, and Jason Tatum each got 2. I'm good with this breakdown. I'm a little surprised Jokic only got 2, but I know, is he really going to win yet another MVP? I'm surprised Embiid got 0. I'm sure that's a health-related thing. SGA at 7, I think that's a function, and we'll get to this in a second in terms of team success. People assuming if the Thunder are going to be really good, their best player is going to get a ton of votes. And I think he finished 3rd in MVP voting, 3rd or 4th in MVP voting this year. So I buy that. And I think SGA is great. I think he's a top 7 player in the league. Will he win MVP this year? I don't know. I think I made a case on Locked On Fantasy Basketball a few weeks ago that my bold prediction for this year was Ant would finish top 2 in MVP voting. I think SGA and Ant are going to be right there. I think Luka is going to be right there. So I don't know, him getting a couple votes, that kind of jives with somebody thinking he's the best player in the league now, somebody else thinking he will be in 5 years. Of course, he's going to be in the conversation for MVP. So I certainly get that. All right, there's 2 or 3 more of these, 4 more of these that we'll hit here in just a moment. And then we'll move on to talk a little bit about Anthony Edwards' comments that he made that are still getting play because it's the dead time of the offseason. He made those comments at the worst time. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, we'll talk about it in a second here. But his comments about the older generation. So we'll hit on all that. We'll do a little bit of team salary cap stuff. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Big thank you once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen of the day. For your second listen, go enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA. Available on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, a couple more of these NBA offseason votes from executives, coaches, and scouts. Who will be the rookie of the year? Zach Edey of the Grizzlies got 8 votes. Reid Shepard of the Rockets got 5. Alex Sarr got 2. Stephon Castle 1. Tristan Da Silva got a vote. The only non-lottery pick to get a vote here. Of course, he was picked 18th by the Magic. It says, this is interesting. It says, well, I won't bury the lead here. Rob Dillingham also got a vote. Edey got 8, Shepard 5, Sarr 2, Castle 1, Da Silva 1, and Rob Dillingham of your Minnesota Timberwolves 1 vote. It says here the lone non-lottery pick to receive a vote was Da Silva, who's taken by the Magic with the 18th pick. The East executive who picked Silva compared his game to the 18th pick of last year's draft, Jaime Jaquez Jr. of the Miami Heat, another older college player who immediately stepped into a role on a playoff team. Yeah, he may be the best rookie. Like, I'm not going to make that argument either. But to me, that's also different than who's going to win Rookie of the Year. Because if you're predicting awards, you have to bake in what are people going to think, right? Not who should be the Rookie of the Year based on what I think will happen. Like, that's part of my thing with Ant being the MVP. Do I really think Ant will be the second best player in the entire NBA this year? I don't. I hope he is. I don't think it's likely. But do I think there's a shot? More people think he's better than he is, and he gets some of those MVP votes because of the personality, the team success, etc. Yes, I absolutely do. I would factor that into Rookie of the Year because just because Tristan Da Silva has a Jaquez Jr. type season doesn't mean he's going to win Rookie of the Year. So that would be my pushback there. Zach Edey getting 8 votes. I think he's certainly going to, he's going to see the minutes, right? He's going to play a ton. He's going to get to play with John Morant, provided health and staying on the court for all the reasons Ja hasn't stayed on the court, which health, of course, is one of them. So I get that. Reid Shepard, 5 votes. Yeah, he's going to play a lot for a team that's going to be on the fringe of the playoffs, most likely, or at least try to push for it. So I would probably go Shepard here, but Edey's going to have a shot. The other guys, Dillingham, the case for Dillingham is similar in that he's going to be a rotation player. He's the rare lottery pick that will join the rotation of a playoff team and be given minutes with a good team, which means there will be visibility. There'll be on national TV. People will be paying attention to the Wolves because they're winning. He'll play with Ant. And there's a bit of a void in bench scoring. Obviously, they have the reigning 6th man of the year, Naz Reid, but backcourt scoring wise, besides Ant, you need some consistent. The Wolves need consistent scoring. That's why they brought Dillingham in. He's a good shooter. He's going to have opportunity. He's going to have the chance to score. So I buy that there's a case for it. I think putting him in the top 5 or 6 makes sense. I don't think he wins it, but him getting 1 vote out of 18, that makes sense to me. I do think that there's a case to be made. I don't know. I should have checked the FanDuel odds for Dillingham, but I think it's certainly possible. Who will be the best player from the rookie class in 5 years? No Timberwolves listed here. Of course, no Dillingham. Reid Shepard got 8 votes. This is interesting too, because Edey's not on this list at all. So 8 of the 18 thought he'd win Rookie of the Year. Nobody thought he'd be the best player in 5 years. Reid Shepard got 8 votes. Stephon Castle 3. Donovan Clingan 2. Nikola Topic gets 2 votes. Buzelis gets 1. Bub Carrington gets 1, and Dalton Connect gets 1 as well. So yeah, that's a little bit of a different list. Which team will win each conference? The East, Boston got 13 votes. The Bucks and Knicks each got 2. The Sixers got 1. That breakdown makes sense to me. In the West, the Thunder got 14 votes. Dallas got 2, and the Wolves got 2. Here's the thing. I was asked actually on Locked On NBA on Monday. I talked to Jackson Gatlin on Locked On NBA. He asked me to power rank 4 teams, and he gave me OKC, Dallas, Minnesota, and Denver. And I power ranked them OKC, Minnesota, Denver, Dallas. Denver's not listed at all as a conference winner or a title winner on this list. I know they had a bad offseason. The Thunder got 14 votes to win the West. And we'll touch on this in a minute, but they got 7 votes to win the title. They had a really good offseason, and they were the number 1 seed in the West. But 14 out of 18 votes for them to win the West is a lot. The fact that Dallas, who went to the finals, or Minnesota, who's a young team that went to the conference finals, each only got 2 votes is kind of crazy. I expected the split to be like 10 for OKC, 3 each for Minnesota and Dallas, and maybe a couple votes for Denver. But OKC getting 14 votes is kind of crazy. There's still some depth issues. There's still some shooting question marks. There's some, can Hartenstein and Chet Holmgren play together heavy minutes because they're getting, at least in the case of Hartenstein, paid. In the case of Chet, he was drafted to do that, to play a lot of minutes. What does that look like long term? Jack Borman on the Minnesota Basketball Party always talks about how OKC is still continually overrated. We saw in the playoffs in the second round them get knocked out. How is this team going to survive in the playoffs? I think the Wolves are better built for a playoff run than OKC. Anyway, I like OKC, and I did power rank them first. To be clear, I did. As of right now, they're first. But 14 of 18 votes really surprised me. Who will win the title? Boston gets 8 votes to repeat, which is, of course, very hard to do. It's been done like once in the last 20 years, right? I'm pretty sure Golden State. OKC got 7 votes. Dallas, Milwaukee, and the Timberwolves each got 1 vote to win the title next year. I should go back and look at last year's, this version of last year's, to see if anybody picked, Dallas to go to the finals, or, certainly nobody's picking Minnesota to be as good as they were. So that's all that to say. 1 vote out of 18 for the Wolves to win the title. It does say in this write-up, it says it was an East executive that picked Minnesota to win the title. And the East executive said, I like their growth to be faster than the Conley and Gobert decline, and I like the Towns-Gobert pairing than most. That's a great quote. I mean, that's a great way to put it. Will the growth of Ant and the gelling of Ant and Cat with Rudy and Jaden McDaniels be faster than the decline of 38-year-old Mike Conley and low 30s-year-old Rudy Gobert, and better than the concerns about the Towns-Gobert pairing? I like it. I like that positioning of it. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. I want to talk about the Anthony Edwards quotes. Let's tee this up here, and then I'll get into it here in a moment, in just a moment. So Anthony Edwards, of course, made the comments, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, where he said Michael Jordan was the only player with skill in the 80s and 90s. I think I'm going to try and find the exact quote here. Okay, here we go. He says, quote, I didn't watch it back in the day, so I can't speak on it. And then he spoke on it, and he said, quote, they say it was tougher back then than it is now, but I don't think anybody had skill back then. Michael Jordan was the only one that really had skill. You know what I mean? So that's why when they saw Kobe, they were like, oh my God, but now everybody has skill. End quote. So we talked about this in the Minnesota Basketball Party last Wednesday. We're actually going to talk about it the next episode in your feed. We're going to talk about it again this week as well, but really from the Kevin Garnett standpoint. So I did want to touch on it briefly here. And I may repeat a little bit what I said on the Basketball Party, but those guys will have their own takes. Reggie and Ron and Jack and Sam will have their own takes on this. So I'll give you mine here as well. So teeing that up, I want to talk about that next. Then we'll hit a quick salary cap here if we have time at the end of the show. That's what we'll close out with today. All right, so here's the thing. Anthony Edwards said what he said. Anthony Edwards always says what he says, if that makes sense. He literally said, I can't speak on it. He says he said he didn't watch it. And he's mostly talking about stuff that happened before he was born. Maybe he is. 80s and 90s was before he was born. So he doesn't really know. Like, if I had to guess, and I'm speculating here, he's probably watched some Michael Jordan highlights on YouTube. He's probably watched some certainly dunk contest stuff. He may have watched some, Isaiah Thomas or some of those guys that like, but has he watched full games from the 90s? Has he? I don't know. Like, it's the most Ant thing ever for him to say, I didn't watch it and I can't speak on it, and then still speak on it and still give a pretty, I don't know if outrageous is maybe a little strong. Like, he gave an opinion. And Magic Johnson, of course, said, I can't respond to a guy who's never won a championship. Like, and of course, predictably, you've got the same old heads that are going to get way too upset about it. But that's the NBA culture that we live in now, just the culture period, not just NBA. Like, first of all, Ant is just doing Ant stuff. Like, and also the other thing that gets me about this is, remember when the Wolves were, one seed earlier this year, one seed for much of the, January, February, March time period, and then into the playoffs, and all the interviews he did when he was asked about the Michael Jordan comparisons, he handled them great. At times he didn't mind it. At other times he's like, hey, look, like, he gave the one, I can't remember who it was with. I think it was ESPN, where he was like, look, I'm my own guy. Like, I want to be my own guy. I don't want to be compared to Michael Jordan. And that's a great way to handle it. But nobody was really concerned then, when he wasn't like batting those away. He's done the armband and the leg band and some of the stuff. Like, there's clearly, he's not shying away from the comparison, and everyone loves that. I haven't heard people get too angry about that, at least not on TV. Not the Magics and the KGs and the Shaqs and everybody else and the Charles. Like, nobody was getting too angry about that. But now that he made an offhanded comment that he admittedly shouldn't have made, especially, he even knew he shouldn't be making it because he said he wasn't going to, and then he kept talking. That's the most classic Ant thing ever. And people just got to take that with a grain of salt. He doesn't know. He doesn't know about this. And the point I made on Basketball Party last week, on Wednesday's Basketball Party show, and actually probably make the point again this week on the show, it depends on how we're defining skill. Like, post skill, obviously, those guys were way better. Hakeem and, all those guys. Anybody that played in the 80s and 90s, the post skill was much greater than it is today. That's one thing. The handles, the dribbling, like, outside of Kyrie and like a handful of guys now, like, obviously, you look at Isaiah Thomas and you look at Jason Kidd and you look at Jason Williams and like guys like that. Like, if we talk about that, it was greater then. But if you want to talk about, whether it's Euro steps or the ability to shoot from long range or leaping ability, overall athleticism, we can have that conversation because it looks a little bit better for the players of today. It's not a simple black and white conversation. It's dependent on how you define skill and how we want to like try and parse this. And Ant was just doing what Ant does, and that's talking out of the what's the right way to say this? Just saying what came to his mind. Well, admitting he shouldn't be doing it and that he didn't know what he was talking about because he didn't watch, and yet we're still super angry about it. We could be upset that Ant is still, immature when it comes to some of these interviews. That's, I don't know. I wouldn't be upset about it. It's just, he's 23, right? Like, he's said worse things. He said more controversial things. He's made mistakes before. This is not on the same level as those for a variety of reasons, but I don't know. I think we can move past this one and admit that he didn't know what he was saying, and you can have a real discussion over the word skill and what guys in the 80s and 90s were better at in early 2000s and what guys now are better at, because it's not the same thing, and that's okay. And Kevin Garnett, on the All the Smoke podcast, him and Paul Pierce went in the weeds a little bit on it. KG said something about, or here, I'll read his quote. He said, "You got to know what you're talking about to be in the argument or be in the discussion what we're talking about. I root for you, young fella, but you don't know what you're talking about, young fella, because what you said don't make no sense." And then he goes on to say, like, 20 years ago, you couldn't get to a triple step back and you better make it. And then he said we had efficiency back in the day, which is, of course, I get what the point KG's making. It's if you were going to shoot a tough shot, you better make it. And KG was really good at shooting tough shots and turnarounds and step backs. He was. And guys weren't doing the James Harden, as KG's called it, a triple step back. They weren't doing Euro steps. They weren't doing some of that other stuff. And there were hard fouls. It wasn't as efficient for all of those reasons, because of the hard fouls, because guys were trying to shoot turnaround jumpers more often, stuff like that. The mid-range, that's another skill, right? The mid-range skill, other than Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, Chris Paul, a select few guys, mid-range jump shooting was a skill back then that doesn't exist now. But there's also a reason why that was worked out of the game. So there's a push and a pull there. I don't mind KG's comments. I think he at least was reasonable about it. Paul Pierce was kind of, decent. All that to say, it's much ado about nothing. It's August. If Ant had said this in like November, nobody's probably talking about it because there's basketball happening. But right now, everyone's so concerned, or I shouldn't say so concerned. Everyone's concerned about it because there's nothing else going on. The Olympics are over. We're waiting for training camp. There's no free agency or trade movement. That's why we're talking about it. Speaking of, I want to hit this very quick, and we may get back to it Friday because I didn't leave a lot of time today. There was a write-up over at hoopsrumors.com, which is a great site for just like keeping up on stuff happening around the league. And they did an offseason check-in on the Wolves, broke down the roster. I've done it here on the show, so I don't want to like get too in the weeds on it, but they made a couple of good points. Like they go through the signings, they go through the trades, they go through the draft picks, and they go through the salary cap situation overall. So I want to hit a couple of those notes. I don't want to, again, I'm not getting in the weeds on the roster today. We've done it before. It's a conversation for another day. But they do note the Wolves are over the cap, they're over the luxury tax, and they're above the second tax apron. They're not hard capped. They don't have any exceptions available, which we know. And they do have one traded player exception available, which is going to be difficult to use. I'll read the first paragraph, what they said. It says, the Timberwolves' proximity to the second tax apron hampered their ability to make roster moves this season, limiting them to minimum salary offers for free agents and preventing them from aggregating contracts or taking back more salary than they sent out in trades. Of course, that is the penalty, the primary penalties for being above the second apron. It says, instead, they're going to live with the front office living with second apron restrictions. They let Drew McLaughlin, Kyle Anderson, Monte Morris go, replace him with Rob Dillingham, Terrence Shannon. And then they go on to talk about 13 players in guaranteed salaries. Remember, the roster size is 15. They have 13 on guaranteed salaries. PJ Dozier is on a partially guaranteed contract, guaranteed for $1 million. But there's a penalty to everything now because they're above the second apron. So they make the point the Wolves are unlikely to add a 15th player because of those penalties. Remember, they did that last year too. They had to play with that roster minimum. They ultimately elevated Luka Garza. They signed TJ Warren. They signed, who was it? Justin Jackson, I think, middle of the season. He played in a game or two to kind of satisfy the roster minimum requirements. So there's going to be some of that this year too on minimum deals. They also talk a little about the Rudy Gobert extension, which we've touched on here. One important note, a lot of times, so players on rookie contracts looking for extensions, there's a deadline in October for those to be done. That's not the case for Gobert. His player option that he has for next season, the 25-26 season, would be replaced as part of a new deal. And so assuming that's the case, he remains extension eligible all season. So the Wolves could extend him in March. They could extend him in April. They could extend him in November. There's no real rush there. And I would be willing to bet that now I should say for Gobert would probably prefer to do it sooner rather than later because he's only getting a little bit older. And what if he doesn't look as good at the start of the year? What if he, God forbid, he gets hurt, something serious? He wouldn't have any leverage in an extension. The team probably wants to wait until the ownership arbitration hearing in November before they make a final decision on anything related to Gobert. So something to keep an eye on. It could happen at any time. I could be wrong there. But that'll be something that could happen at some point. And the motivation there, of course, is to extend him for more years, not lose him after just 4 seasons in a Wolves uniform for nothing, but also to bring down the average annual value and buy out that player option of the following season effectively, which would help from a cap standpoint as well. So we'll talk more about that as we get deeper into as we get closer to the season. We talk about some stuff preseason, stuff to keep an eye on. The Gobert contract situation is certainly part of it. All right. That's all we have for today here on the show. Of course, we'll be back on Friday. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. Wherever you listen to podcasts, you can also watch on YouTube and also on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can also follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, C-K-E-N. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.